Okay, thanks, Daniela. I'm so excited to be here and have the opportunity to talk to all of you about watering your landscapes. And I think by the end of the presentation, you'll have a much better understanding about how our desert plants or plants in the desert use water, need water, and how we apply water so that we can take care of them the best. As Daniela told you, I'm an Arizona native, and I actually graduated from ASU with a degree in education. And then kind of took a little detour for a few years before I got back into my love, which is, botany, biology, anything that has to fit in along those lines. So I worked for the city of Chandler for 11 years. And now I come back and teach classes, which is also something I love. The class materials that Daniela spoke about, you should have received, include a resources list, and I'll be referring to this as we go through the program. There's also one called Water Use in the Landscape, which is basically a summary of the class, a written summary of the class that also has some really good information. There's a little worksheet called Sprinkler Output, and we're going to use that later on in the presentation. I'm going to ask you to participate with me in filling that out, and also a runtime worksheet. So hang on to those, and we'll use them about halfway through the presentation. I'll also be referring to a booklet, Landscape Watering by the Numbers, which is the one in the center here that you see. It's also available online. And the hard copies you can get from your local city water conservation office, or most of the libraries have them available. They're free, and it's just a wonderful tool to have. It's online, so if you don't want to pick up a paper copy, then you can access it online as well. Of course, we live in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, which is a pretty dry and hot place for most of the year. We had some great monsoon rains this summer, and I know about you, but my weeds are growing like crazy. And now we're kind of heading into fall. I can't wait for fall when the nights start cooling off. But because we live in the desert, a lot of times people are under the misconception that plants need lots and lots of water. And some may, but most of them don't. So I have a question for you. Where do we use the most water? Is it indoors or outdoors? You don't have to use a Q&A to answer this. Just answer it in your mind. And the answer is outdoors. Up to 70% of the water that you use, perhaps pay for each month, goes outside on the landscape. And because we live in a desert, it's more important to be careful with how much we use and how we use it, and not to waste it. You may have seen big green areas, golf courses, parks, perhaps your HOA common areas. And you may be wondering why, if we live in a desert, are we using so much water on those places? And it's because most of the newer green belts, parks, etc., golf courses are using what they call reclaimed water. This is all the water that goes down the drains in your home. The cities capture it, treat it, and reuse it on landscapes. And it's a great way to use the water that would otherwise just be lost down the drain. It's delivered in purple pipes, just so you know, once they're buried, you can't see them, but purple pipes. And in the landscape, the valve box covers are purple. There are a number of things that affect the irrigation needs of plants. What do you suppose those would be? Of course, it's our climate. It's and depending on the season, you know, the temperatures, whether if they're hot or even if they're cold, can impact how much irrigation a plant or a landscape needs. Also, wind increases a plant's water needs, and sometimes rainfall is not all that helpful, depending on when we get it and how violent, I guess you could say, how violent the storms are. It doesn't always do the plants the most good when it comes down so fast that it doesn't soak into the soil. And speaking of soil, your soil type is going to affect how often and how long you water your landscape. The types of plants you have, whether they're considered desert adapted or if they're high water use. The size of your plants, and we're going to be looking at this here in just a few moments. What we call microclimates, or the exposure. If they're on the west side of your home, then those plants typically are going to need more water because that's a little bit more hostile environment. And maintenance. Who knew that maintenance would affect the irrigation needs of plants? But it's true. The more often they're pruned, the more water the plant needs to replace that foliage that was lost. So speaking of water, how much rain do we get during an average year? I don't know, the last several years haven't been what we would typically call average. This year was pretty good. But, you know, historically going back, 20, 30 years, it's usually about, 8 inches, 7 to 8 inches per year. And once the rain hits the ground and soaks in, then water loss happens. It happens from the soil. And when water is lost from the soil, what do we call that? There's a term we use to describe that. Yeah, that's evaporation. And what about the water lost from the plants themselves? That's called transpiration. It's, you could kind of think of it like, perspiration in people, but plants, it's called transpiration. And on hot days, on hot windy days, the transpiration rate is higher. And together, this term is called evapotranspiration. So for plants, that takes into account the water loss from the soil and the water loss from the plants themselves. Evapotranspiration. It's a term you might hear. Now, what do you suppose our evaporation rate is here in the desert? If you have an open body of water, let's say your swimming pool, for example, or a lake, how much water is lost during a year? I have a chart to show you that explains it. And you can see that, in the winter months, the evaporation rate is pretty low, a couple inches a month. But look at June compared to January. In June, you will lose almost a foot of water from an open container, a lake, a pool, and so it totals almost 80 inches of water a year. That's a lot of water. Now in our landscapes, we have to think about our soil, whether it's clay or sand or silt, because how much we water is going to depend on the type of soil that we have. And the water that we use in our landscapes is going to vary as well. And there's been a lot of research done on landscape water use, thank goodness. And I have some information that I'm going to show you here in just a couple slides on landscape water use. Drip irrigation is perfect for us living in the desert because it puts the water right where the root system is, right on top of the soil, doesn't spray it into the air, so we don't lose as much water as would be otherwise if it were sprayed into the air. But even so, there's still questions, how much water should you put on? And how long should you run your irrigation system? And how often should you apply it? So that's what we're going to look at for the first part of this presentation. There's a big difference between sprinklers and drip systems, not only in how they apply the water, but in how much water. In a sprinkler system, especially if it's a real hot, dry day, up to 50% of that water can be lost to evaporation. Whereas with a drip system, as I mentioned before, it's applied near the soil line and there's very little nominal loss to evaporation. And each one has a purpose and a specific use. And a number of years ago, both Arizona State University and the University of Arizona did some studies, and it showed that our Arizona landscapes are being overwatered, and sometimes by a lot. And even though a landscape can look, identical, whether it's being overwatered or not, it's important to try to apply only the water that it really needs. Here's some information from the Desert Botanical Garden. They also did a study a few years back where their goal was to try and figure out how long a plant can go in between waterings before it shows signs of stress. So they started in the fall with 3 groups of plants. They had a low, medium, and a high group. And when they started, they were watering the low group 1 time a week, the medium group 2 times a week, and the high group 3 times a week. This study operated over a period of about 8 or 9 months. So when they ended, they were watering very differently. So between the time they started and the time they ended, they gradually changed the interval of the watering schedule. Not the amount of watering, but the interval. So at the end, that low group, they were being watered once every 24 days, whereas the high group, instead of being watered 3 times a week, it was just once every 8 days. That's a pretty big change. And here's what their little test plot looked like. Now, the plants aren't labeled, but you can kind of tell which ones are the same plant. There's a number of them in here that have white flowers, green plants with white flowers. There's some small sort of silvery gray shrubs. There's some shrubs with orange flowers. But I want to bring your attention to these particular 2 plants, the small one here and the larger one here. And this is at the end of the study. So which of these 2 do you think was in the low group being watered once every 24 days at the end of the study? Once every 24 days. If you said the small plant, you're right. The only difference in the plants is the size. The plant that was receiving more water, at the end of the study, the larger one in the top arrow, where the top arrow is, that was being watered once every 8 days. So the only difference was in the frequency of the water. And even with the little plant on the left being watered once every 24 days, it still was not stressed. So the point is that you can water a lot less frequently and still have healthy plants. They may not grow as fast, but in some cases that's okay, because if plants grow really fast, sometimes you may need to prune them. So we're going to look at 3 simple parts of landscape watering. Number 1 is knowing how much water your plants need. Number 2 is knowing how much your watering system applies. And then the third one is matching these two up so that you get the right amount of water applied at the right frequency. So step one is knowing how much and how often your plants need water. Why do plants need water? There's a number of different reasons. They need water to metabolize, to make food. They also need it to dissolve the chemicals in the soil, the chemicals and the minerals, so the roots can absorb them. They need water to maintain strong leaves and stems. And they also use water to help transport the food they make from the leaves down to the roots, and vice versa for the roots to absorb the nutrients in the soil and transport those up to the plant. And then they also use water to cool themselves down. That's that transpiration. It's important to water properly because people often forget, or perhaps they just don't know, that plant roots need oxygen. If waterlogged soil, there is no oxygen, or oxygen is greatly reduced. So we need to be sure that the roots are getting enough oxygen. Too much water can cause bad things like diseases of the trunk, the roots, and the leaves. It can interfere with the nutrient uptake. If the soils are waterlogged, the plant cannot process or absorb the nutrients, and it may just make them grow excessively. So how deep do roots grow? Well, depending on the size of the plant, you can use the 1, 2, 3 rule. And this is an image from the Landscape Watering by the Numbers booklet. It's on page 4. And you can see small things have very shallow roots because they're small. Medium shrubs, bushes, their roots go a little bit deeper, and trees go the deepest of all. Here's another way to look at it. The 1, 2, 3. So up at the top, we've got top left, we have small plants, ground covers, annuals, even cacti. That they need about a 1 foot root depth. You want the water to soak down to about 1 foot. For medium plants and shrubs, down to 2 feet. And for large plants and trees, the water should go down to 3 feet. So think about, here's a rule that is not in the book, but think about this. If you were able to spread an inch of water over an area evenly, how deep is that inch of water going to soak in? I know from some of these summer storms at my house, we did get at least an inch of rain, but of course, most of it runs off and doesn't stand around long enough to soak in. But if it did, how deep would the water penetrate in a clay soil? And the answer is in the Watering by the Numbers book. It soaks in about 5 to 7 inches, kind of depending on your clay soil. If it's fairly loose, it'll soak in a little bit deeper, but around 5-ish inches. That's not very deep. I mean, it'd be great for grass and perhaps some small plants, but it's not going to really help water a tree much. So how deep does water go? And here's some different soil textures. We've got sand, we've got loam, and then we have clay. And if you were able to put 1 inch of water, as the little image shows, in sand, the water is going to soak down pretty deep, but it doesn't spread out very far. In loam, it'll soak down, fairly deep, maybe 7 inches or so, and it spreads out a little bit. But in our clay soils, which is what we typically have here in the valley, it doesn't soak in as deep, but it spreads out in a wide area. Here's another rule. And this one I think makes a great visual. A gallon of water will moisten about 1 cubic foot of soil. So think about a gallon. You know, you've got a gallon milk jug or juice bottle. A gallon jug will moisten about 1 cubic foot of soil. So a foot by a foot by a foot. For a small plant, that's adequate. So if you have a 1 gallon plant, if you apply a gallon of water, that should be adequate to moisten not only the container soil area, but some of the surrounding soil. But 1 gallon of water is not going to be enough for a large tree or even a large shrub. I don't know how many of you know your irrigation system well enough to know if you have what size emitters you have on. But typically, when a system is installed, they put the 1 gallon per hour emitters on the tubing. So if you're running your system for less than an hour, you're not delivering enough water for most plants, assuming you only have 1 emitter per plant. And how can you tell how deep the water is going? You can use some really low-tech tools to help you find that out. You can use a probe, or you can use a long screwdriver, or this little piece of equipment is, they still sell them at the home improvement stores, and they're not very expensive. I think they're less than $3, maybe $3.50. It's a irrigation turner honor for old manual irrigation systems. And it's really easy to pop that little weld at the very bottom where it has that little U shape. You can pop that off, and then you have a pretty handy little probe. It's about 2 feet or so long. And after your irrigation system runs, you take your probe and you go out and you push into the soil. And assuming you don't hit a rock, you should be able to probe easily in moist soil. But where the soil is dry or where the water has stopped, you won't be able to probe as well, or perhaps not at all. And the screwdriver works really well for lawns, because most of them aren't long enough to do shrubs. But in probing lawn areas, you can easily push a screwdriver in to determine how deep the water has penetrated. If we just use nature as our guide, we can learn a lot. And if those of you that have taken my classes before may have seen this image. It's an ironwood tree, which grows only in the Sonoran Desert. But in nature, when it rains, the water is deflected over the canopy and it falls to the ground at the edge of the branches. And there's a term that we use to describe that area where the water drips off. And yes, it's called the drip line. So the drip line is at the edge of the branches. And in nature, a tree like this has 90% of its feeder roots at the drip line or beyond. Just think about that. The feeder roots, the ones that are up close to the surface that absorb the water and nutrients, are at the drip line or beyond. There really aren't any feeder roots in closer towards the trunk. But in our manufactured landscapes, where do we put the emitters? Yes, we put them right next to the trunk, or maybe not you, but when your landscape was installed, the emitters go right next to the trunk. And frankly, that's where they have to be in the beginning, because that's where the container plants, that's where their roots are. They're close to the little stem or the trunk. But as a tree or plant ages and matures, the emitters should be moved out towards the drip line. There's a couple reasons for that. And one is because what type of soil is more stable? And this applies to trees mostly. Is dry soil more or less stable than moist soil? And if you said dry, you're right. So by moving those emitters out, we allow that soil next to the trunk to dry out a bit, and it's more stable for the tree. Trees don't blow over, and you're moving the emitters out away towards the drip line where they belong. You may have to move your emitters around the whole tree, perhaps add more emitters to deliver the right volume of water. And there's a little illustration that shows you exactly how to do that in the next slide. This one shows you the root system of a tree. So at the drip line, there's the feeder roots are only in the top, perhaps 8 to 12 inches of soil. I said that wrong. 8 inches or so of soil. The anchoring roots are deeper, but the ones that absorb the water and nutrients are very shallow. Here's the one that shows you where to put the emitters. And this is from the Watering by the Numbers booklet. So whether you're starting out with a small plant or perhaps even a small tree that only needs one emitter in the beginning, as it grows, you need to add emitters and move those emitters towards the drip line. Or if you're installing a fairly good-sized tree, then you need to add multiple emitters, either at the drip line or perhaps somewhere in between, because in the beginning, if you start with a fairly large, you can say a 36-inch box tree or something, you will need to water where the roots are from that container soil, which could be just, perhaps a foot away from the trunk, with the intent of moving them outward as the tree grows. And this is the rule of pizza. Those of you that haven't eaten, it might make you hungry. So we're going to start out with a formula, but don't let your eyes glaze over because you don't have to do any math. I've done it all for you. But the area, of course, is pi r squared, pi times the radius squared. And let's look at a small pizza. This is a 10-inch pizza. The area of that pizza is 79 square inches compared to a 12-inch pizza where the area is 113 square inches. But if we bump up and maybe grab the family size or the extra large pizza size, a 20-incher, then the area jumps up to 314 square inches. Now that could mean that ordering the extra large pizza is a better buy than a small. But if we think of it and apply it towards our landscape plants, this could be the root area, the soil root area. So as the root system grows, and here in this example, as the radius doubles from 10 inches to 20 inches, the root system increases by 4 times. So if we want to water the root area, we're going to have to apply 4 times as much water to that 20-inch tree than, well, maybe make it a 20-foot tree, a 20-foot tree than a 10-foot tree. It makes a big impact, just a small increase in the diameter or in the radius. So how much water do your plants really need? And this is in your booklet on page 9. And it's just a little table that shows you the plant canopy diameter. And there's 3 different groups. So we've got, trees, shrubs, and then ground covers and cacti in the last row there. And then across the top is the diameter, whether it's 1 foot or very out at the end, there's 18 and 20 feet. But let's just look at a 10-foot tree. So a tree with a 10-foot diameter canopy, and we're going to assume that the root system is at least that big, it needs 59 gallons of water each time you apply it. So that's pretty close to 60 gallons. So that's how much. Or you can look at a smaller plant. Let's look at a 4-foot shrub. It needs 12 gallons of water each time you apply it. The frequency is going to vary, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But this is the amount. This is how much. How often is going to depend on a number of different things. It depends on what type of plant material you have, whether it's desert adapted or high water use, and the seasons. Now, these are not, like spring, summer, fall as we know them. These are sort of like plant spring, summer, fall. And right now we're in the summer column, which runs basically from May to October. It's still pretty hot. And last time when I checked my car temperature coming over here, it was 105. That's still pretty darn hot. And then we want to water as deep as this last column shows you. So for desert adapted trees, right now they need water once every, 1 to 3 weeks, 7 to 21 days. And the roots, the water needs to go down to a depth of 24 to 36 inches. For a high water use tree, like perhaps a citrus, it needs water a little more often, once every 7 to 10 days, but the same depth. And this table is reproduced in the Landscape Watering by the Numbers booklet. It's in there a couple of different places, but on the inside back cover is really easy to get to. And the last 2 rows are for grasses, whether you put in Bermuda grass or if you overseed with rye, a cool season grass. And speaking of grass, so those of you that have Bermuda right now, we're in September. And so according to the table, it needs to be watered once every 4 days. And this is ballpark. This is just a rule of thumb. If it rains, of course, you can probably skip an irrigation. And with the ryegrass, if you overseed it with the rye, notice how in October it says water once every 3 days. That's after you get it germinated and growing. And then once it starts to mature in November and December, you can back off. You can reduce the interval, reduce the frequency on how often you water your rye. If you have someone taking care of your landscape for you, this is an area where they very seldom make adjustments. When they water or set your irrigation timer up to germinate your grass, watering 3 or 4 times a day, sometimes that never changes throughout the whole winter season. So I would recommend that you kind of keep an eye on how often they're watering, because once they've mowed the grass a couple of times, you can really reduce the frequency on how often you water the rye. And notice for Bermuda, if you don't overseed, in December, you only need to water your Bermuda lawn once every month. So December and January, once a month is great. Plus, we generally get some winter rain, so you may not even need to water that often. How much you apply is going to depend on the plant type. We mentioned this a little earlier. So on the left, we have brittle bush, which is one of our desert natives. It survives on almost no water at all. And on the right, we have an orange tree. So obviously the orange tree is in that high water use category, the brittle bush in the desert adapted category. So they're going to be very different on how often you water these 2 plants. Another factor to look at is, of course, the plant size. Tiny little plants are not going to need near as much water as something larger. It's just logic. And then your irrigation system and the efficiency of those systems is going to be another factor for how long and how often you water. Throughout the seasons, throughout the year, a plant's water demands change. So in the wintertime, they're pretty darn low, but notice that in June, that's the maximum. That's when plants need water the most. It's hot, it's dry, it's usually windy. There's no humidity to speak of until the monsoons start to roll in, usually in mid-July or so. So June is the hottest month. So if you can make adjustments to your watering system, once a month, that's fabulous. If you only get out there, 3 or 4 times a year, at least you're doing something to change the watering frequency instead of just letting it run the same all year long. And what about grass? I imagine some of you have grass, and if you don't, this will be information you can just store away for later use. Maybe you can tell your neighbor. Light, frequent waterings create shallow roots. And because the plants are shallow rooted and generally not as robust, then weeds often can grow too. In fact, the 2 plants in this image that have the wrong root system are weeds. So what we want to do is water deeply so that our grass can develop a deep root system. Once water soaks into the soil, for grass, usually, 6 inches would be great. A little deeper would be even better. Once a volume of soil is moistened, then evaporation pulls that moisture back up to the top. So the deeper we can water, the deeper the roots grow, the longer the moisture stays in the root zone. And of course, the grass is going to be healthier. To determine how much you should water, depending on the time of year, you can use a number of resources. This one just happens to be what they call AZMET. It's managed by the University of Arizona. If you just Google search for AZMET, AZMET, you'll find the turf watering information, and you can navigate your way through. Click on the lawn watering guide, and it will show you that for this time of year, which I checked this yesterday, about 0.46 inches of water is needed on your Bermuda grass if you watered 3 days ago. And of course, unless it's rain. So this is the Bermuda is on a 3-day schedule. Now, once fall hits, usually October-ish, this will change to rye, and they will give you the values for your overseeded ryegrass. But it's a pretty handy tool. Okay, step 2 is learning how much each part of your watering system is going to apply. And this image just shows a little turf area with some shallow cans, like tuna cans or pet food cans. And they call this a can test. And the cans are evenly spaced out in a designated area of lawn. And you can run this irrigation system for a given length of time, measure the water, and it will show you how much water is applied. And you would be amazed at the difference in the amount of water collected in the cans. You would think it would all be the same, but you can have one can that's almost dry and another can that's filled to the brim. The sprinkler systems are notorious for not watering evenly. And one thing about sprinkler systems, if the spray from one sprinkler head is not reaching far enough, it can leave dry areas right around the sprinkler head itself. So the top illustration has what we call inadequate coverage. So the spray from the sprinkler on the right needs to spray as far as it needs to get to the sprinkler next to it. And the little illustration on the bottom shows that. And that way it eliminates those dry areas right around your sprinkler head. There are a lot of irrigation components in a system, including the hardware, so controllers, the sprinkler heads, the piping. And some of the other parts, like the little emitters. These, sometimes they're marked as to how much water they apply. They're not always in gallons per hour, however, I found that out. And other times they're not marked at all. The color coding means nothing. It only means something to the manufacturer, but it doesn't mean that all red emitters put out a gallon of water. In fact, they could be very, very different between, you know, rainbirds and orbits and whatever else might be on the market. So little emitters on the top left, you can see the gallons per hour marked on at least a couple of them. The one on the left is 2 gallons per hour, and then the one on the right of that image is 4 gallons per hour. The configuration of sprinkler, or not sprinkler, but emitters, they can be installed right against the polytubing, or they can be on the little micro or spaghetti tubing. There are some that are adjustable that put out little streams of water. These are great for trees or plants that need a lot of water because they can put out 10 gallons per hour or more. But if you try and reduce the amount, I found that they really clog. So if you're trying to slow it down to where it's going to give you a couple gallons per hour, it's better to just go with one of the sort of standard emitters like up on the upper left. If you're not sure how much your drip emitters are putting out, you can estimate the flow rate. And this little table shows you different drops. And it's going to get you pretty close. Or you can run the system for a given length of time and measure the amount of water that you collect in, you know, a measuring can or some, you know, a cup, and then measure the water. If you're trying to deliver 10 gallons of water, here's just a comparison of 3 different methods. You can run your hose, just a couple of minutes, it's going to give you 10 gallons. Or if you have a 1 gallon per minute bubbler, now bubblers are different than the drip emitters. The bubblers, you can run for 10 minutes and you'll get 10 gallons. Or if you have a 1 gallon per hour drip emitter, it's going to take you, it's going to take you 10 hours to deliver 10 gallons. We measure water from sprinklers in inches per minute, so they're kind of a little class by themselves. And if you do have grass, this is a really easy way to determine how long you need to run your system to deliver the right amount of water. So each time you irrigate, you should try and apply about 3/4 of an inch of water to your grass. And if you'll do this with me, grab your little handout that says how much, it has number 2 at the top and says how much does each part of your water system apply. And we're going to do a little bit of math. You can use your phone calculator to do this. It won't take you but just a moment. So we're going to we're going to run our sprinkler system for 15 minutes, and we're going to put the cans out. We're going to do a can test, and then we're going to measure how much water we were able to collect in the cans. So we spread our cans out, we turned on our sprinkler system for 15 minutes, and we're done. Now we're going to measure the imbalance that we collected. So using your little worksheet, I'm going to give you some numbers. We're just going to use 5 cans. So can number 1, we have 0.7 inches. Can number 2, we have 0.3 inches. Can number 3, 0.5 inches. And cans 4 and 5, we have 0.4 inches in each one of those. So do the math and tell me how much water we collected total, and then we'll get the average of the cans. So then divide that by 5 cans, and then that will determine the average amount of water that we collected in the cans. So do that real quick. If you have any questions, use your Q&A. Okay, so what's the average? You should have come up with 0.46. So in 15 minutes, the average water that we collected in the cans was pretty close to ½ inch, 0.46. So in our little table at the bottom of this slide, where it says average can measurement, we're going to do 0.46. So it's kind of right in the middle between 4 and 5. So in order to deliver 3/4 of an inch of water, we need to run our sprinklers, and this is all done for you using the little table. We're going to need to run our sprinklers about 25 minutes, according to the results of our can test. Now that wasn't too tough, was it? Okay, and the next exercise, we'll use the second sheet, the one that says Plant Irrigation Workshop or Worksheet. And this is duplicated from the Landscape Watering by the Numbers booklet. So, and this is an image of that page. So what they have here are, in the example at the top, they have the valve number, the plant size and what kind of plant it is, the number of emitters per plant, would be column number 3. It's at the top of the page. Number 4 is the emitter output in gallons. 5 is the total output in gallons. And then 6 is the gallons required that the plant really needs. And then how long we need to water to deliver that amount of gallons. So at the top, that is that's in your book that's already given to you. What I would like you to do is do a couple of examples. So here's example number 1. So in this situation, we have on valve number 1, we have 2-foot shrubs. Doesn't matter what kind they are, they're just 2 foot tall or whatever, 2 foot wide. And each one has one emitter, and that emitter puts out a gallon per hour. So what we need to do is determine how much water that plant is getting. So it's getting a gallon per plant per hour, right? Okay. How much water does it really need? And to determine that, we go back to our table, which I've listed at the bottom of the page, and it's also at the bottom of the screen here. So a 2-foot shrub, how much water does a 2-foot shrub need? Just use the table. So 2 foot at the top, follow it down to where it says shrub. A 2-foot shrub needs 4 gallons of water. So how long do we need to run the system to give the plant 4 gallons of water? 4 hours, right? And I know this sounds a little excessive. So really, all you need to do is give it, 4 emitters, and you don't have to 4 1-gallon emitters, and you could deliver that amount of water in 1 hour. But for this example, it's just a great exercise. All right, here's the next one. We have on valve number 2, we have 10-foot trees. They have 4 emitters, and each emitter puts out 2 gallons per hour. So how much water are they getting? So 2 gallon per hour emitters, and they have 4 of them. So they're getting 8 gallons per plant per hour. How much water does a 10-foot tree need? Use the table at the bottom. Find out how much water a 10-foot tree needs. It needs 59 gallons. So how long do we need to run the system to deliver 59 gallons? This is as it is, as it's set up as it is. How long would we have to run our system? 7 hours. Yeah. And again, you can change the number of emitters, you can change the volume of the emitters so that you don't have to water that long. Now, the next example is for citrus trees. And this is on valve number 4. They've got 4-foot citrus trees. They have one emitter and it puts out 2 gallons per minute. So these are bubblers, 2 gallons per minute. So how much water are they getting? They're getting 2 gallons per plant per minute. How much do they need? A 4-foot tree. Yeah, 16 gallons. So how long do we need to run that bubbler system to deliver 16 gallons? 8 minutes. Okay, that wasn't too tough, was it? So you can tweak your drip system. You can add more emitters. You can change the volume of the emitters so that you can deliver the right amount of water. Okay, that's it. That's how you get your run times. You probably don't need to adjust your watering frequency according to the seasons. But you don't need to adjust the volume. Once you know how much water your plant needs, you don't need to adjust how much water it gets, just how often. There's other ways of watering. There are still some areas in the valley that have flood irrigation. You may see these as you drive around. Of course, the agricultural fields use flood irrigation. There's also soaker hoses and laser tubing. Those could be alternatives to your drip system. But a drip system needs an efficient design. And sometimes I call it zoning, but basically it's applying water for different plant types and separating them if you can. So in this illustration, if you follow the kind of golden line coming from these are valves in the very front of the house. So this is the gold line is a tree line. Just it's a valve designated for trees only. And then we also have a red line, and that one is going to shrubs. There's a blue line, which I think maybe it's going to a vegetable garden. It's on the side of the house, or it could be a specialty area. Maybe it's cactus or something. But the point is that if you're able to separate your plants by their type, by trees, by shrubs, and so on, then it's much easier to water because the water demands of trees are way greater than shrubs. There's a few key things to remember with your drip system. Is you should never exceed 200 feet of the black poly, that's a 1/2-inch poly pipe, from the valve to the end of the run. Once you get past that, the friction loss in the line increases and the emitters just don't work as well. You should also never exceed 200 gallons per hour on the run. So if you have 200 1-gallon plants, that's your maximum. Of course, that's probably a pretty rare case, but just keep that in mind for the volume of water. And then never exceed 6 feet of microtrimming after the emitter. Not before, but after the emitter, because again, friction loss, by the time it gets from the emitter to the end of that 6 feet, it may just barely be dribbling out. This is an image also from Landscape Watering by the Numbers, and it shows you how many emitters to use. This is a suggestion for different types of plants. And you can see for, if you just compare the trees, the 10-foot to 20-foot trees, you can use 4 to 6 4-gallon per hour emitters, or 5 to 10 2-gallon per hour. For shrubs, you can use 1 to 2 1-gallon or 1 2-gallon per hour for the small shrubs.
Excuse me, Kathy.
Yeah.
That actually is one of the questions, and I think you're addressing it right now.
Okay.
And we're actually debating it here ourselves. Does it matter if the output is 4 gallons and you need 4 gallons and you've got a 4-gallon emitter? Is it better to have a 4-gallon emitter and you run it for 1 hour? Or is it better to have, or does it matter if you've got a 1-gallon emitter that you run for 4 hours? So
It
4
doesn't,
gallon,
it
one,
doesn't
you know,
really, it doesn't really matter. What might matter are what other kind of plants are on the same valve. So if you've got something that needs more than 4 gallons, you may have to, that's on the same line, same valve with that 4 gallon per hour plant. And you don't want to run your system for that 4 hours. You know, that would probably be the only thing I can think of that would matter as to how long you run it. But
So basically, you'd want to try and find a balance between the other plants that are on the zone and their needs so that you can have a balanced run time to apply the correct amount for each plant.
sure, because 4 hours may be too long for one plant. Maybe your 4 gallons is okay, but maybe you've got a tree that needs, you know, 20 gallons, let's say, or a plant that needs 20 gallons. So you would, it's kind of, you just have to compensate by adding more emitters, emitters that put out more volume. But there's as long as the 4 hours doesn't matter to you, the plant is not going to mind. That's a great question, because so many plants are mixed on the valve. You know, there's lots of different plant types that are mixed on valves.
thanks, Kathy.
Okay, so here's an example. And then we'll, it's 7 o'clock, so I have to kind of speed it up here. I don't want to keep it too late. So your neighbor has a tree with a 5-foot canopy, and they have one 1-gallon emitter on the tree. So how much water, I would say, let's say how much water is this tree getting? Let's, or well, we really don't know that because it doesn't say how long they're running their system. So how much water does this tree need? It's a tree with a 5-foot canopy. And you can go to page 9, or you can use that table that's on the worksheet to determine how much water this tree needs. Okay, so it needs about 22 gallons. So how are they going to deliver that 22 gallons? What are their choices? If they only have one 1-gallon per hour emitter, they're going to have to run it for 22 hours, right? Or they add more emitters, or they may add an emitter that puts out, if they use one of those adjustable emitters that puts out 10 gallon per hour, then they only need to run it for a couple hours. But there's a lot of solutions to that. But definitely it needs 22 gallons of water. Drip systems have so many parts. Oh my gosh. We've got, of course, the backflow preventers, the valves, the filters, the pressure reducers, the elbows, oh my gosh, the goof plugs, the piping. Before you know it, if you do your own drip installation and repair, before you know it, you've got a whole little toolkit built up. And this is just an illustration of the drip system underground, because you generally see it, but you have your controller on the side of the house, and that's all. The water system is hooked up to your home water, and they use a backflow preventer to keep water from moving backwards. The valve box is generally underground, as is the tubing, and you may only see the emitters popping up above ground unless they're kind of buried under a bush. Drip systems are not maintenance free, as some of you may have already discovered. You have to do seasonal adjustments. If the landscape is older, you may find that some things need to be replaced. Sometimes it's hard to find the drip emitters under a bush because it's just gotten so big that, it's kind of grown over it. It's a good idea to flush the lines once or twice a year. And if you can find the end of your half-inch poly tubing, you can unbury it and then take it apart and let the system run for 5 or 10 minutes just to flush that line. Maybe that's even too long. A few minutes. It's always a good idea to clean and inspect the filters. That's right next to your valve inside the valve box. And also once or twice a year, you should let your system run for longer than normal. You normally run your system for, let's say, 2 or 3 hours. Let it run 2 or 3 hours more, and that will create a larger wetting pattern, a larger area of moisture, which dissolves any accumulated salts and will kind of push them away from the root system of the plants. Salts are your plant's worst enemy. And these are just things that can go undetected, especially if you aren't at home during the day when your drip system or your sprinkler system comes on. Things, happen, and then lawnmowers hit the sprinkler heads, and they can, get broken or spring leaks. So just, turn your system on and walk your yard while it's running every now and then, so that you can see where there are things that need to be repaired. With sprinkler systems, it's really important that all of the sprinkler heads are matching by manufacturer, because if you have someone taking care of your landscape and your sprinkler head cracks or needs to be replaced for whatever reason, they'll often just grab whatever they happen to have on the truck, which may not be the same brand as what the rest of your system has. So you may have things mixed, like Orbit and Rainbird and who knows whatever is out there. And the reason you don't want to mix them is because different manufacturers have different precipitation rates. So they apply water differently in different amounts or volumes depending on the manufacturer. So it's a good idea to try and match all your sprinkler heads. And all you need to replace is the nozzle. You don't need to replace the whole housing. And those are not too expensive. We talked a little bit about the troubleshooting. There's things that can happen out there. If the power happens to fail, if your controller doesn't have a battery backup, you may lose your programming. So make sure that you replace your battery once a year. The newer timers do have a non-volatile memory, so they hold your programs. But there's nothing more frustrating than going out and having to re-enter all the irrigation information. And for newly installed plants, instead of running your whole system for the new plant, what I do is I just take a milk jug, an empty milk jug, and poke a hole in the side near the bottom, not underneath, but on the side near the bottom, and fill it up with water, take the lid off, fill it up with water, and go set it next to the new plant. And I can deliver a gallon of water that way without having to turn the whole system on. And you only need to do that for, a week or two, and then it should be established enough to go on the rest of the system. This is a great resource for plant selection if you're looking to install some plants when the weather gets a little cooler. It's amwua.org/plants. And there's lots of great images in here. If you're watering containers, you just have to water more often because the soil volume isn't as large and they tend to dry out a lot faster than plants that are in the ground. I just want to throw that in. And you'll also need to add fertilizer more often because as you water containers, a lot of that water runs through and leaches out the nutrients. So it's 10 after 7, and I have about 5 minutes of each irrigation controller stuff. We won't have an in-depth look at controllers because the speaker next week is going to be giving you just really great information on learning to program your irrigation controller. But this will kind of give you a heads up and just kind of an initial look at controllers, including what the heck they can do. What are they? Well, of course, they take the information that you need to water your landscape, and they turn the irrigation system on and off. There's some things that they will do and won't do. So what they will do, they'll run it at the times that you program in. They'll turn it on in the middle of the night if you want it to do that, and they'll water while you're away. But what they won't do, they won't adjust themselves for the different seasons. Now this is your standard controller. Most of them won't shut off when it rains unless you have a rain sensor. And if there's a leak, they won't shut off. When you're selecting a controller, use one or select one that has multiple stations. So at least 3, 6 is even better. And multiple programs. Usually 3 programs is standard, but I've seen some with less. Look for one that will allow you to water every 14 days or more, because some trees, especially our desert trees, only need to be watered once a month or even longer than that. And if they only will allow you to schedule for 14, that's still could be way too often. And also look for those that have run times of greater than 2 hours, so that you can water for 6 hours if you need to. And the battery backup, we talked about that. There's only a few pieces of information you need to enter a program. The first is the current day and time. The next is how often you want it to water, whether you want it to water on Mondays and Thursdays or every 7 days. You need to tell it what time to start irrigating. And you'll need to tell it how long you want it to water. This is a typical irrigation timer. This is an Irritrol. It's not what they call a smart controller. This is just kind of your standard controller. And up at the upper left, it has 3 programs, A, B, and C. It also has, at the very bottom, of course, it has a manual button. In the center, this is your, to turn it off, or you can put it on manual, but you can also set it in the center to set your programs. And that's what we're going to look at right now. We're just going to run through this really quickly, give you an overview. So you move, it slides, this little slide at the bottom, it slides left and right. You want to put it in the center to enter your programs. And then you need to enter the current day and time. The arrow is like a little dial, and the arrow at the top, you give it 1 click to the left, and then that'll give you you can put in the day, and then of course there's current time. You can enter the watering days. So if you want it to water on, Sunday and Wednesday, or if you want it to water what they call skip days. So if you want to water every 7 days or every 10 days, you can also enter that information as well. You can enter the start times at the bottom. And then the valves themselves are on the right side of this dial, and there are 6 of them. And this is where you enter how long you want each valve to water. Once you're done, you slide that set program at the bottom, you slide it to run after you've entered all your information, and then you should be good to go. So let's look at some important things to understand. It's always best to group the stations or the valves, it's kind of synonymous, that require the same watering frequencies on the same program. So we've got 3 programs, A, B, and C. Let's take a look here. All right, so at the very top row, we've got program A, B, and C. We've got the station description, the start time, and the watering days. So we're going to start out with program A. And the watering days are going to be Monday and Thursday. Now, this is just an example. This particular schedule has program A, they put both of the sprinklers, both their sprinkler valves on the same program. So valves 1 and 2 are on program A, and they're going to water Monday and Thursday. Program B is going to run every 14 days. That's that skip day option. And we've got 2 valves, 3 and 4. Program C is going to water every 21 days. And it just has 1 valve, number 5. Enter only 1 start time for each program, even if you have multiple valves on the same program. So I'm going to go back to that schedule. So our program A with the sprinklers, we're going to start at 4 a.m. You only enter the start time for the first valve. And this is where a lot of people get confused. They think they need to order or enter a start time for each valve. No, it's the program. The start time is for the program. So the program that's going to water these sprinklers needs to start at 4 a.m. The next program B, this is the desert shrubs and the citrus trees. And notice these are really different. You know, we have desert shrubs, they're on drip, and the citrus trees on bubblers. They're going to start watering at 7 a.m. It's the program. Program B is going to start at 7 a.m. Not necessarily, don't think of the valve, it's the program it's going to start. Once it waters valve 3, after 30 hours, then it'll run right to valve 4 and it'll water for 25 minutes. But you don't need to put the time in, just for the first time for the program. And then the same for the last one, program C. That one's going to start at 11 a.m. And that's also on the skip days, every 21 days. It's also important to enter the start times and avoid overlap. So we'll go back to this example, and we've got 4 a.m., 7 a.m., and 11 a.m. Eventually, there could be a time where every 14 days, if we had entered, the same start time at 4 a.m., because it's going to be on every 14 days, it would overlap with either the Monday, Thursday of the sprinklers, or even the valve number 5 at every 21 days. So be sure and give it enough spacing in between. So it's going to start at 4 a.m. and water basically for an hour, 30 minutes on each one. And then it'll be rest. And then it'll start at 7 a.m. and run for 3.5 hours basically. And then it'll rest, and then it'll run at 11 a.m. for 6 hours for the desert trees. But you don't want those to ever overlap. And just remember that the controller operates the irrigation system, but you control the controller. There are a lot of new technologies out there, including what we call smart or weather-based irrigation controllers. They will take into account a lot of different things like the plant type, the soil type, the kind of irrigation system that you have, and it'll water automatically. Not everyone needs those, but some people that like techie things use them and are really happy with them. There are also sprinkler nozzles that are rotary. The little illustration or the image at the bottom kind of shows you that. These actually deliver bigger water droplets, and so there's less loss to evaporation. So that might be something that you would want to convert to. or at least, investigate if it's something that you're thinking about. Of course, rain sensors, those can be added to most irrigation systems. If you have a pool, there are liquid pool covers that reduce evaporation from the pool surface. And then things like synthetic turf, where you don't have to water grass at all. You don't have to have a battery, an electronic operated controller. You can use battery operated ones if you like. And these work really well, and they're not too expensive. But you have to have a hose or the tubing to operate them to get the water to your plants. If you want to try and set up a watering system online, you can go to Water Use It Wisely, and they have an online watering guide, and you can enter all the information about your own specific drip system or sprinkler system, and it will create a watering guide for you. There are lots of different references. I think I have most of these listed on your reference list, so we won't spend any time there. And our message is to help you save water. The town of Chandler, town of Queen Creek, and the city of Chandler have been great partners in getting these classes to you. And here's additional resources from each of their websites. And with that, that's all I have for you. If you have any questions, you can type them in now, and we'll see what we come up with.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. That was a great presentation, and thank you everyone who attended the workshop today. We do have a question for you, Kathy.
Okay.
How do you adjust watering for a newly installed landscape?
A newly installed landscape. Actually, on page 14 of the Landscape Watering by the Numbers guide, there is it's not really a table. Let me find it here. I'll look at it. It just tells you that if for the weeks 1 and 2, water every 1 to 2 days in the summer. And then weeks 3 and 4, water every 3 to 4 days. Weeks 5 and 6, every 4 to 6 days. Week 7, every 7 days. So that's a pretty good way to get your plants or your landscape established. They also have the same if you were planting in the fall, but I think fall to me says like maybe, like October-ish, and maybe late October, because the days are still pretty warm. So of course you're going to have to water pretty frequently for the first several weeks. So watering once a day, once every 2 days right now is a good rule of thumb. Because it has been so hot, watering every day for even the first week wouldn't hurt them, and then move to once every 2 days. Just kind of gradually extend that interval out. If you're comfortable adjusting your controller with the frequencies, then you can tinker with it to get your plants off to a good start. The key is going to be watering deeply. So check your emitter sizes. And if you've got 1 gallon per hour emitters, you would want to run your system for at least an hour. And I think I might go for 2 hours just to moisten the surrounding soil for new plants. And you can always back off if it looks like they're getting too much water. Does that help?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Let's see. We just had one come in. I'm getting ficus and citrus trees this week. Can I put all the trees on the same valve?
You can put them on the same valve, but your citrus trees are going to need more water than your ficus. Now, having said that, I don't know how big they are, how big the trees are, but follow that table on page 9 or on the handout that we gave you. So if your ficus and citrus trees if they've got a 5-foot canopy, they're that big. That's pretty big. Maybe that one won't be that big, but just remember that a 5-foot tree is going to need 22 gallons of water, and the frequency is going to vary, but you have to water for the weakest link if you put them on the same valve. So I would probably water for your citrus. And if you're going to be installing this time of year, you're going to need to water probably like that, the recommendations I just read off from page 14. You'll need to water, once every 1 to 2 days for the first week or so, and then start gradually backing off. So you'll need to apply that 22 gallons if they have 5-foot canopies, according to that schedule.
Okay, great. We have one more question. This person lives in an HOA and it sounds like they're required to have grass, but it ends up turning into like weeds and dirt. They're not sure when and how often the grass is watered. Do you have any ideas how to help them have grass? I guess this has been an ongoing issue with 3 different landscape companies.
Okay, I would do a couple of things. After your sprinkler system comes on, and then let it run, and then go out about a half an hour afterwards and use your screwdriver and poke around in the soil in your yard. If you can only probe down an inch or 2, they're not getting enough water. The grass isn't getting enough water. And so that means you need to run the irrigation system longer, the sprinkler system longer. So on the other hand, if you probe the soil and it's really easy to push in, it may be too much water. But I'm thinking if it's bare and doesn't look good, I'm thinking there's not enough water being applied. Or it could be that the sprinkler heads are not uniform. In other words, when they get nicked by things like the trimmers or even the lawnmowers, sometimes there's gaps in the spray when the water comes out. And it could be that the reason the soil is dry in some places or bare could be that there's no water reaching it. But the probe will tell you if it's dry, you won't be able to probe in very far. And if you can turn the system on and watch the sprays, you may find that you've got gaps in the spray head uniformity when the spray comes out of the sprinkler head itself.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We do have one question. Is there a city program for homeowners to install a system to use recycled water for the landscape? I don't know about Queen Creek. Dina, can you comment on the Chandler rules for harvesting or recycling water for the landscape?
Sure. There are a very few neighborhoods that have access to reclaimed water. They're in the Ocotillo management area. But primarily the recycled water is reserved for commercial and HOA community spaces. It's not those are not easy systems to manage. And we've just found they don't really allow that for residential use unless you're in those very few communities that were opened up to that early on.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Connie with Queen Creek. So any of our Queen Creek residents out there, if you want to know this answer, basically that's the same thing with us. We use recycled, reclaimed water for our parks and a few of our HOAs, but it's very limited access. We do have a few areas, though it's not reclaimed water, it's CAP water that does do flood irrigation, but those are in very limited areas as well.
Great, thanks, Connie. All right, well, I think those are all the questions we had come in through the chat. And if you do have other questions, our contact information is on the screen. So feel free to take a picture of that or a screenshot. And you can always email us or call us if you have other questions. As Kathy mentioned, we do have a class on programming controllers next week if you're interested in that. But otherwise, just again, thank you everyone for participating in tonight's workshop. We do have a quick survey when you exit the class, and we would appreciate if you just took a minute to fill out the survey and let us know how we did and how we can improve. But we will go ahead and let everybody go. Looks like we're done right at 7:30. So thank you, Kathy, and thanks again, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.